You know that I love it when we come across stories in the Bible when women get mad at Jesus and they aren't afraid to say so. It's true. That's because as someone who encounters suffering and death and human depravity so often as a pastor, I want and need a God that it's okay to get mad at. That's the remarkable God we encounter in this story. God who can withstand our anger. God who weeps with us. God who suffers with us. God who redeems us. God who reminds us that it is never too late. This story we hear on the last Sunday of Lent before the beginning of Holy Week, the death and resurrection of Lazarus, foreshadows Jesus' own death and resurrection next week. Jesus has been talking about the resurrection of the body for a while to prepare us, and he's out to prove something about who he is with this story. We know from the text that this family, Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, is a special family to Jesus. The text says that Jesus loves this family, and it's rare that the text says that Jesus loves a person, a specific person, but Jesus loves this family. Jesus loves Lazarus. These are Jesus's best heart friends, the kind of friends that are like family, those kind of friends. We also know that Mary and Martha send Jesus word that his beloved Lazarus is sick and dying, and we know that Jesus doesn't go to him when he hears that. In fact, Jesus says that Lazarus got sick for the glory of the Lord and to glorify the Son of God. To me, this sounds a lot like those people who tell you that everything happens for a reason when your loved one gets a terrible diagnosis. If I were Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, those words would bring me no comfort. Those words would be a stinging slap in the face, I imagine. So a few days pass and Lazarus dies without so much as a visit from his friend Jesus. And 3 days after his death, after Lazarus has been laid in the tomb, already stinking of rot, the text says, Jesus arrives then with his disciples in Judea. And Martha goes to meet him, but Mary is too pissed at Jesus to even pick him up at the airport, so she stays home, right? She stays in her house, the text says. Martha says to Jesus, in essence, "Where were you? You could have saved Lazarus from dying, and you didn't." And when Mary finally goes to Jesus, she falls at his feet and says, "Lord, if only you had been there, my brother wouldn't have died. Lord, if only you had been there." This scene was likely messier than it sounds when we read it on the page. I imagine the grief was loud and angry and impolite, as grief so often is. When confronted by the keening, the wailing, the deepest sadness of his friends, Jesus wept. The enormity of their grief choked up even God. The enormity of his love for Lazarus made even God weep. "See how much he loved him," the people said. We've heard this story hundreds of times, so maybe we are no longer surprised when we hear it. But what happens next must have been the most shocking thing ever to the people gathered. After all, staying dead is what people are supposed to do, right? Yeah, well, it's true. But Jesus shouts at the tomb in that moment, "Lazarus, come out!" And the previously dead man gets up and walks out, Lazarus, resurrected and unbound from his grave cloths, unbound. The shocking good news of the gospel is the impossible truth that love is so powerful, God can raise the dead with it. This is the 1-year anniversary of the day that we memorialized a beautiful life here in this sanctuary of Jeff Cranson, who died of a cruel and punishing and heartless disease at age 39. So you and I know from experience that we can raise the dead with our grief and our love, both of which come from God. You and I know from experience that we can unleash the love on the world. God's love is resurrected, it is unbound, it is unleashed in us every day of our lives. We worship a God who weeps with us and redeems even the tomb of our grief. So for those of us who are attempting to roll away the hard stone of grief blocking the tomb we are now lying in, for those of us who are wondering today, where is God? If God had shown up earlier, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be in this mess. May we be surprised by a resurrection and an unbinding we weren't expecting. May the stone be rolled away. May we be surprised by the light of dawn, and may our wounds be unbound and exposed to the air. That's how they heal. And sometimes, you all, the wounds that need healing are religious ones. You may have noticed that I have really screwed up my Lenten Facebook fast this week. Did you notice that? My denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, is in significant crisis right now, and I'm guilty of the hubris that leads to thinking that I can solve it somehow for myself by reading all the things. Do you all try to do that? Do you try to read all the things about politics and try to solve what's happening in this country right now just by reading? Yeah, it doesn't work. But I went back to Facebook to read my news feed. And this month, there was a very public fight about the lack of racial diversity within the ranks of the upper management of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and it became so heated on social media, and there were groups of people writing angry, open letters expressing their pain, and the president of the association actually stepped down. He stepped down in the wake of this fight just yesterday, and he only had 3 months left in his term before his 8-year term was over. So he just stepped down, leaving us without a leader. And he won't even attend our final associational meeting this June in New Orleans to say goodbye. Now, all of this is a very complicated story that I'm not going to tell you, which you can read about it if you want. I'm angry at almost everyone involved in this fight, if I'm being honest, and I only watched it from the sidelines. I saw hardly any grace in the conversation, that's why. I wondered when Christ would show up, and as far as I could tell, people refused to invite him in to the conversations themselves. My people feel betrayed, though, by the leadership vacuum the president left behind in his wake, in addition to the wounds of racism yet to be healed. And people so often feel betrayed by religious organizations that fail to live out their professed values in the world. And this is worse. Devastatingly, the same day that we found out that the president of the UUA stepped down, we also found out that the former executive director of the UU Christian Fellowship, which is an organization that I'm closely involved in and have been the leader of before, or one of the leaders of, was arrested for and apparently confessed to serious charges of harming innocent young lives. And I'm not going to go into the details of that either today, but suffice it to say that this is yet another earthly reminder that evil is real. The minister in question has been a mentor and an inspiration to many of us, someone who my colleagues and I felt embodied the ministry of Jesus better than most. He worked with vulnerable populations in Oklahoma, serving, feeding, and clothing the poor, and we cannot square this image of him with the other one. Do you know what I mean? So the grief that some of my friends are feeling can only be described as the demoralizing, faith-destroying kind. Do you know that kind of grief? The presence of this evil, even in the hearts of those who bring Christ to others, is why I so often need a God that is big enough that I can get mad at. Do you know what I mean? Like Mary and Martha, I want to cry out, Lord, if you had only been here, how are you going to redeem this one? This colleague's betrayal of sacred trust made me think again about all the hundreds of stories that I have heard as a pastor about the harm and abuse that religious leaders and the church have inflicted on so many of you. I can't tell you how often I hear stories of religious leaders who have betrayed your trust, who have harmed themselves, who have harmed others, so many others, who have destroyed the sacred container of the church for you for a season or even forever. I can't tell you how often I hear stories from religious leaders who have hurt you so much that you have lost your faith in God entirely. Religious leaders cause so much harm because our wounds and our actions are stand-ins for God's. And this is an unfortunate truth because none of us are any closer to God than any other human being on this earth. And so often we betray the people entrusted in our care with our own brokenness. And Lord, are we broken? God, have mercy on all of us. When this happens, it feels like God has absenced himself, saying everything happens for a reason, which are empty words. Brene Brown's research on shame and religion suggests that the only way to heal religious wounds caused by religious community is by having a corrective experience of sorts in a religious community, to go back maybe to the site of the wound, I guess, to go back to that place where the wound is and to wait for God to show up and redeem everything, to unbind our wounds, to raise up what has died. I think that's why I have so much admiration for those of you who show up here anyway. It's brave, and maybe it's even necessary. It's like using anti-venom serum to suck out the poison of a snake bite. It's the most hopeful thing that I think I can think of this morning. It is resurrection. After all, we need God to show up in the places in our life where God previously felt absent. We just do. We need to shout, Lord, if only you had been here earlier, you could have saved even what has died in us. And mostly in that moment, we need God to weep with us with a love that knows no bounds. And then we need God to raise us back up, unbinding our wounds and exposing them to the air. This is a God who makes all things new. So, beloved, stop by the Potter's house this week, especially during Holy Week. And then at Easter, be shocked by resurrection again. Be surprised by love. Don't give up on God's arrival. Don't believe that death has the final word. You don't have to stay in the shape that you're in. So you who are broken, stop by. You who need mending, stop by. Give God the fragments of your broken life, my friends. The potter's going to put us back together again. May we be surprised every day by a resurrection and an unbinding that we were not expected. Amen.